One of the nice things for President Trump is that every time President Trump does a normal thing, the left decides that the world has ended. That the world has gone crazy. And I use as evidence of this the fact that I was on Bill Maher's show on Friday, and I was really more expecting the conversation to surround the things that Bill and I have in common, such as opposition to political correctness, and aversion to identity politics. And instead, the entire interview turned into 10 minutes about Russia collusion, which, again, if you're obsessed with the Russia collusion story at this point, let me suggest that your priorities are not straight. There's no evidence to suggest right now that President Trump has colluded with Russia during the campaign or afterward. There's just not. Okay, if the evidence were there, I would talk about it because I've been very fair about this. But I'm not going to pretend that there's a lot of evidence there. The point is this. The folks on the left have decided that President Trump must be ousted by any means, and they've decided that President Trump represents a great break in America's history, and they believe that America itself is deeply broken. And so now the left has decided that deep American institutions, not Donald Trump, other key American institutions, these institutions must be destroyed as well. They believe the Supreme Court now has to be packed, that they need 11 justices on the Supreme Court instead of 9, because maybe that way they can get more liberal Supreme Court justices. They believe that the First Amendment must be overthrown. There's an article in the New York Times. It is 2,000 words long. It is not an opinion piece. It is a reported piece from Adam Liptak. Okay, Adam Liptak is one of their reporters. It was on A1 of the New York Times over the weekend. And the title of the piece is How Conservatives Weaponized the First Amendment. How Conservatives Weaponized the First Amendment. Now, you may ask yourself, what does that even mean? How do you weaponize the First Amendment? It's a right. How do you weaponize a right? That's like saying that law-abiding citizens weaponized the freedom from unreasonable search and seizure under the Fourth Amendment. How do you weaponize that? It doesn't make any sense, right? But the New York Times believes that conservatives have weaponized the First Amendment because they don't like the First Amendment. That's right. The New York Times, a newspaper dedicated, presumably, to the proposition of freedom of the press, a newspaper that was involved in some of the great free speech cases in our nation's history, from the Pentagon Papers case to libel cases in the past. The New York Times now says that the First Amendment has been too broadly construed. That's how far the left has been broken. They believe the First Amendment must be curbed because it is an institution of power. The left is always going on about how the reason the left loses, the reason the left is not victorious, is because the system itself is corrupt. If it weren't for the corrupt system itself, then Marxism would have already taken over the world and everything would be hunky-dory utopia. But in the United States, where freedom reigns, they believe that the freedoms themselves are a threat to the Marxist worldview, and so freedoms themselves must be torn down. These are elements of a hierarchical structure. The First Amendment, you might think when I say freedom of speech, that means anybody can speak. What the left says is what that really means is only powerful people can speak. And that's why we need to crack down on the First Amendment through force of government. The government has to shut down free speech to save freedom. If that makes any sense to you, that's because you're a moron. So here is the New York Times going on about this. Here's Adam Liptak. He says, on the final day of the Supreme Court term last week, Justice Elena Kagan sounded an alarm. The court's 5 conservative members, citing the First Amendment, had just dealt public unions a devastating blow. The day before, the same majority had used the First Amendment to reject a California law requiring religiously oriented crisis pregnancy centers to provide women with information about abortion. Conservatives, said Justice Kagan, who is part of the court's 4-member liberal wing, were weaponizing the First Amendment. Now, I just want to point out, this is not a court's liberal wing, it's a left wing. Okay, it's a left wing. The difference between liberal and left is that liberals believe that we ought to maintain rights like freedom of speech, even if they believe in more government intervention in the economy. The left believes that all of these rights ought to be subject to the needs of the community. That basically communitarianism is the way, that if it violates their precept of the hierarchy of various power groups, then the First Amendment should be subverted. The New York Times says, the 2 decisions were the latest in a stunning run of victories for a conservative agenda that has been increasingly built on the foundation of free speech. Now, notice how that's worded. And the way the New York Times is wording that is not that the free speech agenda that has been promulgated by the court helps conservatives, is that it is the conservative agenda that is using the mask of free speech in order to push itself. Except for the fact that this free speech agenda has nothing to do with conservatism per se. It just has to do with the idea that you should be able to say what you want without the government compelling you. Conservative groups, building and borrowing on arguments developed by liberals, have used the First Amendment to justify unlimited campaign spending, discrimination against gay couples, and attacks on the regulation of tobacco, pharmaceuticals, and guns. Well, that's a pretty radical take on what exactly the Supreme Court just did. Instead, what the court just did is they said that the government cannot compel you not to spend on elections, that the government cannot compel you to violate your own religious precepts, that the government cannot compel you to say things you don't want to say or pay money to unions you don't want to join. Why exactly that has to do with a conservative agenda is beyond me. That seems like just a rational freedom agenda. But, this is the New York Times. They say the Citizens United campaign finance case, for instance, was decided on free speech grounds, with the 5-justice conservative majority ruling that the First Amendment protects unlimited campaign spending by corporations. The government, the majority said, has no business regulating political speech. The dissenters responded that the First Amendment did not require allowing corporate money to flood the political marketplace and corrupt democracy. Well, that's a stupid argument. Okay, the First Amendment does require me to be able to speak as much as I want, and that involves me actually spending money on things. If the First Amendment did not involve you spending money on free speech, then presumably the government could pass a law saying that corporations are not allowed to spend money on, say, printed materials in the 60 days before an election. You know what's a corporation that spends money on printed materials 60 days before an election? The New York Times. The New York Times. Okay, the libertarian position has become dominant on the right on First Amendment issues, says Ilya Shapiro, a lawyer with the Cato Institute. It simply means we should be skeptical of government attempts to regulate speech. That used to be an uncontroversial and non-ideological point. What's now being called the libertarian position on speech was in 1960s the liberal position on speech, which is exactly right. Right? What Ilya Shapiro is saying is you're calling it right wing. This used to be the consensus position. And so much of American life has become this. So much of American life is positions that all of America used to hold, and then the left decided it didn't hold anymore. And so the consensus American position is now termed the right-wing position. So, for example, on immigration, the position that we should enforce our borders, the position that perhaps we should actually police the people coming into the country. That was a widespread 100% position in America. Then the left decided that it was intolerant. And now that is a right-wing position to say that we should enforce our borders. The same thing on free speech. It was a widely held position across both sides of the aisle. You should be able to say basically what you want. And then the left decided we don't like that anymore. And so what was left was the right-wing position. But the way that the New York Times posits, the way they pose it, is not that the left threw out the First Amendment. It's that the right decided to cling on to the First Amendment in unreasonable fashion. Why does the New York Times say that? Well, because they're the New York Times, as Andrew Clavin says, a former newspaper. Here's what the New York Times says. Liberals who once championed expansive First Amendment rights are now uneasy about them. Right? Many on the left have traded an absolutist commitment to free speech for one sensitive to the harms that it can inflict. Okay, that's hilarious. So they've decided that they're no longer absolutists on free speech. Instead, they are more sensitive to the bad things that can happen because of free speech, which is a way of saying that we are not going to pay attention to free speech at all. If you trade in the harms that can be inflicted by free speech for free speech itself, free speech is no longer a right. This is like saying that there are certain harms that happen because of the freedom from unreasonable search and seizure. The Fourth Amendment prevents the government from coming into your home and simply just checking out everything that's there for the hell of it. Now, are there societal costs to that? Sure, there's a societal cost to that. It means that not everybody with drugs in their house is going to be seen by the government, for example. Not everybody with an illegal gun in their house is going to be seen by the government. But I'd much rather that a few people have illegal guns or illegal drugs than that the government have a blanket right to come into my home at any time for any reason without actually having to give a rationale. The minute that you start saying that the downside of the right is more important than the right no longer exists. But that's what the left says. The left doesn't like the rights. The left does not like the free speech rights. So liberals were once largely united in fighting to protect sexually explicit materials from government censorship. Now many on the left see pornography as an assault on women's rights. In 1977, many liberals supported the right of the American Nazi Party to march among Holocaust survivors in Skokie, Illinois. Far fewer supported the free speech rights of the white nationalists who marched last year in Charlottesville, Virginia. Now, there is a difference, by the way, in these two cases. I will say that there's a solid case to be made. Justice Bork, would-be Justice Bork, Judge Robert Bork once made this case. He said the pornography is not protected by the First Amendment. There's a pretty good solid case that the founders never intended for the First Amendment to cover dirty pictures. But there's no question that the founders intended for the First Amendment to cover political speech, which does involve Nazis marching in Skokie. Better First Amendment case, just legally speaking and historically speaking, for bad people marching than for naked pictures in public. But in any case, the New York Times says there's a certain naivete in how liberals used to approach free speech, says Frederick Schauer, a law professor at the University of Virginia. Because so many free speech claims of the 1950s and 60s involved anti-obscenity claims or civil rights and anti-Vietnam War protests, it was easy for the left to sympathize with the speakers or believe that speech in general was harmless. But the claim that speech was harmless or causally inert was never true, even if it has taken recent events to convince the left of that. The question then is why the left ever believed otherwise. So in other words, they were happy about free speech when it was anti-Vietnam War protests and civil rights and pornography. But the minute that it turns into religious bakers who actually just want to abide by their scruples, then all of a sudden the left is ready to toss out free speech, which is to say the left was never in favor of the right. They were just in favor of the exercise of the right as they saw fit. The left was never in favor of this is the big problem with the left. The left doesn't believe that you have a right to do anything the left disagrees with. I believe, as a person on the right, You have the right to do lots of things I disagree with. You have the right to march in the street with pussy hats. You have the right to act sexually how you want, basically. I believe that you have the right to, I actually believe that you have the right to smoke marijuana. I think there are lots of things that I believe you have the right to do that I personally find abhorrent. I hate marijuana. I think it smells, and I think the people who smoke it are wasting their time and brain cells. But because I'm a freedom-believing person, I also believe that there are rights that extend to things I don't like. I think the right to free speech extends to Nazis. I hate Nazis. They're awful human beings. But the right to free speech extends to them. The same thing does not hold true for the left. If you disagree with the left, they want to remove your rights. And that's becoming obvious right now.